Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Cynthia Tomaine with Interactive Brokers, and thank you for joining me for today's webinar that's being brought to us by Alpha Architect. The topic of today, SEC cybersecurity requirements and advisors, will be delivered by Patrick Cleary. Now, before we get underway, I also want to introduce my colleague, Emmett Peppers, with Interactive Brokers, who's worked very closely with Alpha Architect for several years. So with that, Emmett, if you could go ahead and introduce Patrick, thanks so much.
Sure. Thanks, Cynthia. Yes, as Cynthia just mentioned, I've been a sales rep for advisors and hedge funds for over 10 years with Interactive Brokers. I've known Patrick and his colleagues at Alpha Architect for several years and seen them grow very robustly along with us for the past, 5 to 10 years. So they've been instrumental for us as a firm to provide feedback that's much needed for us to grow our advisor platform further along the way. Patrick is a former Marine. He's Chief Compliance Officer and Chief Operational Officer for Alpha Architect now. And Alpha Architect, just a little background, they're an RIA with about $1 billion in AUM. Much of that is with Interactive Brokers as the broker and custodian, and their firm mission is to empower through education, and I think that aligns closely with Interactive Brokers' mission as well. So with that, I'll pass it on to Patrick, and he'll take over from here.
Awesome. All right, can everybody hear me? Are we ready to spend an hour of our lives talking about cybersecurity?
Right. You sound good. Thanks, Patrick.
Okay, fantastic. And Cynthia, is my screen up? Is everything okay? Can you see me changing the slides there?
Well, we're on the first slide. Oh, there it goes.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Well, welcome, everybody. I will try and make this as painless as possible. Welcome to SEC Requirements for Cybersecurity, a DIY guide. Main mission here is to help educate you and show you what resources are out there to get started. Goal is not to give you the perfect, 2018 Ferrari version of a cybersecurity program. I'm going to give you the 1996 Honda Civic with 50,000 miles. It'll get you from point A to point B. But the main thing here is just to show you there are a lot of resources out there for you to get started before you start spending time and money on a lot of outsourced solutions. Twitter handle for me is Patrick Cleary01 if I tweet out stupid jokes and also some cybersecurity tips. Also DM me if there's feedback, good and bad, and things we can work on together in terms of cyber. Just want to share best practices here, so all of that good stuff is warranted. So, mission today, let's give you a quick overview of what cybersecurity is. I want to demonstrate that basic cybersecurity is quite doable for RIAs. It's not easy, but it's not complex. There's a lot of things you can do without a tech background to get started. And I want to give you just a couple actionable next steps to build an efficient, effective cybersecurity program. My biggest pet peeve with cybersecurity as an advisor is cybersecurity advice boils down to two different areas. You either get really technical, very wonky, hard to understand implementation advice, which most people don't know how to action, or you get this very high level fluff on Forbes or other, or other publications that basically say cybersecurity is important. All advisors should focus on cybersecurity. And that's like, well, that's great. Thanks for telling me the sun rises in the east and the sky is blue. What am I going to do with this? So bottom line is you can do this, and let's make sure this is a ongoing dialogue, not a one-off. Let us know how we can help you. So if you're stuck in this webinar during your lunch hour, chances are you may be the cybersecurity officer for your firm. And this little pictograph I created kind of epitomizes how most cybersecurity or chief compliance officers get selected. You're probably a small advisor, and here you have, I'll just read it. Here you have the founding fathers, and Adam says, Jefferson says, methinks Adams is most befitting of chief cybersecurity officer. And Franklin goes, indeed, a most noble title for a most noble gentleman. And then Adams is just sitting in the corner, not cool, bro. Not cool. That's basically what I was thinking when our CIO, Wes Gray, good friend of mine, they basically said, hey, you need to be the CCO and we need to better focus on cybersecurity. So I feel your pain. I've been in your shoes. So again, Emmett just said, I'm with Alpha Architect. Our mission is to empower investors through education. We're just here to help out. That's been the most successful business model for us. So do good and help people out regardless of what they can do for you, and it'll work out in the long run. So that's honest to God's truth. If we can help you with cybersecurity, let us know. So you can be a cyber geek. A little bit about my background. I have zero IT experience in my prior life. In 2000 to 2004, I went to Wharton. My concentrations were in finance, accounting, and Chipotle. Then I lost a bet and joined the Marine Corps. I was a combat engineer. I basically blew stuff up and built stuff. My tech experience was limited to my DVD player. I really was not much of a tech guy. And then 2008 today, I went to the preeminent jerk factory of the United States, Harvard Business School. So I got my MBA from Harvard, was a consultant for BCG, then went into asset management as a COO, CCO of Alpha Architect. But then my GI Bill, I was eligible for the GI Bill, and they said, you basically have enough education credits to get a free master's in something. And I said, well, I might as well sign up for something that's relevant to what I'm doing today, and I could get a master's in cybersecurity for free. So I signed up. And I thought cybersecurity was going to be super technical, and I was going to learn all this code and do all these, IT type things. And it really shocked me as to how many skills are required to be a good cybersecurity officer that are not necessarily tech related. And so that's what I'm trying to share those lessons learned with you all today. So before we start talking about cybersecurity, let's just use some common examples from daily life and from our history to kind of better understand what we think about when we think about cybersecurity. Today, many scary things can be solved with a simple approach. So, you had the bubonic plague in Europe in the Middle Ages. What was the solution to the bubonic plague? It was, controlling rodent infestations and making sure you had clean living spaces, food preparation spaces, and avoided, rats and things like that. Relatively simple approach, but people didn't understand this, and so they didn't have that. They didn't have that approach. Same thing with polio. Before the polio vaccine, a lot of different cures that didn't work, but the approach now is pretty simple. Get your kids vaccinated and you can avoid polio. And then something going on in my life right now, a mother-in-law, terrifying. How are we going to handle this issue? And very simple solution, a one-way ticket to Siberia on Aeroflot Airlines, about $2,000. Very, very straightforward. Now, this is not to say that dealing with the plague, polio, or your mother-in-law is easy in terms of, coming up with a vaccine or building a plane, but for the actual solution itself, relatively straightforward. Now, poor knowledge of a subject can create bad solutions. So let's go back to the plague. So nobody knew how to deal with the plague. Nobody knew what it was. And so you have horrible examples in history of what humans thought they should do to cure the plague. So swallow 3 turnips and the plague will not befall you. Or with polio, this is an actual quote, give oxygen through the lower extremities by positive electricity. Some doctors thought if you just electrocute yourself, you can cure polio. That's a horrible idea. And with the mother-in-law, look, honey, this home has an in-law suite. That is a terrible idea, sweetheart. Sorry, I didn't know my wife. I thought my wife was on this podcast. So don't confuse bad solutions with poor knowledge. You have to ask yourself, before we start coming up with solutions that may not fit, let's make sure we truly understand the problem. So let's define cybersecurity. I've come up with the cybersecurity definition that I think most advisors, when I talk to, this is their standard definition of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity defined is a money pit, a black hole for IT dollars to disappear. It's also a catalyst for converting profits into losses, see lawyer, a synonym. And using cybersecurity in a sentence, Tommy, we can't buy groceries this week. We spent all of our food budget on cybersecurity. This is what advisors typically define cybersecurity as. We don't know much about it. We know it's important for regulators, and we probably are throwing a lot of money at the problem, hoping it goes away, and it eliminates our ability to do other things because it's expensive to deal with. Now, We're telling jokes here, trying to make a boring topic fun, but obviously we have to take cybersecurity seriously. Just looking at some of the major breaches in the recent past, Yahoo in 2013 through 14, 3 billion user accounts were hacked because of poor cybersecurity measures. eBay, May 2014, 145 million user accounts. The OMB, basically the repository for all security clearance applications, stolen by the Chinese. 4 million security clearance applications go to an adversary. And then the SWIFT network, February 2016, this was attributed to North Korea. The North Koreans almost got away with $1 billion in a fraudulent attack on the Bangladesh central bank through the SWIFT network. But thankfully, a spelling error raised some eyebrows, and only 101 million was stolen. Some was subsequently recovered. But so just to be clear, even though we're having a little fun here, cybersecurity should and must be taken seriously. And regulators, going towards advisors, regulators are certainly upping their game. So a quick chronology of the cybersecurity space with the SEC. So in 2014, the SEC comes up with its first cybersecurity examination suite. They come up with a list of questions. They talk to all these RIAs and broker dealers, and they see, okay, where are advisors and broker dealers in terms of cybersecurity? Are they prepared? And they come up with a report. They say, surprise, surprise, not everybody's prepared. Here's what we can work on. So then in 2015, they upped their game again, and they launched the Cybersecurity Exam Initiative. They said, okay, last year we saw everybody was deficient. This year, we're coming after you. Here's what we're looking for. Be ready. Then in 2016, the SEC itself gets hacked. So the SEC's filing database that hedge funds use to file their proprietary trades, i.e. secret trades that could be front run, gets hacked. And guess what? They get front run, and it's major egg on the face of the SEC. So now you have a regulatory agency that is looking to make sure it maintains its regulatory authority over cybersecurity. Now they get hacked, and so now they have an additional level of political pressure to demonstrate that they have the ability to regulate cyber effectively. And so they turn up the pressure again. They launch a cybersecurity task force that addresses not only their own internal hacks, but also future potential hacks for advisors. And then this year, we see the first monetary fine from the SEC to an investment advisor, BD, for poor cybersecurity controls. So Voya gets fined $1 million this year for having poor cybersecurity controls that led to some theft of client information. And then also, we have a memo release from the SEC warning publicly traded companies, if you don't enhance your cyber controls, you could be at risk of violating federal law. They're now seeking to tie poor cybersecurity to violation of federal securities laws. So the bottom line here is they're just getting warmed up. That's a great movie, Son of a Woman, highly recommended. Note, Al Pacino does not work at the SEC cybersecurity unit. But the takeaway is very clear. The SEC is making this a priority. It's ramping up, and the SEC hack, as well as more political scrutiny, this isn't going away anytime soon. Now, what is this creating for advisors? So we have all these advisors that don't necessarily know what is expected of them. Cybersecurity can be intimidating if you're not a programmer. What do we do? Well, we start throwing money at the problem, and there is no shortage of third-party solutions for advisors. So you need a special dedicated server, you need new computers, you need custom cyber insurance, you need cyber consulting, you need the special encryption tool we have, you need the special cloud service. What about our SEC cyber exam simulator? We handle all aspects of vendor management. We have a compliance portal. And of course, well, we definitely need a legal opinion from a lawyer. These are all just common things I've seen that have sprouted up that have told advisors, hey, we can help you deal with this problem. I'm not saying per se that third-party solutions are bad for advisors. And I recommend that given your budget and where you are in terms of your own knowledge, you can retain third-party vendors. What I'm advising though is let's take a pause and let's evaluate what the SEC is looking for, what are the standards, and what can you do internally before you start paying Danny DeVito at Wormwood Motors to sell you some kind of cybersecurity solution. So how about a different approach? What we're going to learn today, we're going to have a common sense approach. It's low cost, it's relatively robust, and the underlying principle here is let's use vendors as needed, but not by default. So what is a robust cybersecurity program? If you get audited by the SEC is going to look for 3 basic elements. They're going to look for 1, a cybersecurity manual. What is it you say you do here in terms of cybersecurity? Then in that centerpiece, what are your enabling processes? So you say you have this cybersecurity manual with all these wonderful things you're doing. How do you actually do it? Prove to us that you're doing what your manual says. And then finally, on the far right column, a risk assessment. How are we getting better year over year? The SEC does not want to take a snapshot in time of your cybersecurity program. They want to see a continuum of activity. If you're not very good at the beginning, that's okay. You may get a little bit of a pass, but they want to see you improving over time. What are you doing year after year, quarter after quarter to close those gaps, to minimize that attack surface and become more proficient and proactive in terms of cybersecurity? So how do we actually do this? So this is where we get into the details. Again, if you have questions, we'll hold them to the end, but you can also DM me on how we get there. So the first step is, let's go to the SEC website and learn what the heck the standards are. So you can go to these links at the bottom of the page, sec.gov/spotlight/security. Scroll down to the middle of the page and you'll see SEC resources. Click on investment advisors/investment companies and you'll get SEC guidance. And I strongly recommend you read these 4 articles. You basically have examination sweep reports, the examination initiative I mentioned earlier, and observation from cybersecurity examinations. These are the warning signals. These are the letters from the referees saying, hey, this is what we're looking for. This is where most advisors are deficient. You should read these and compare and contrast to what your firm has today. Then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go to NIST, the NIST cybersecurity section, and read their framework. The NIST cybersecurity section is this link right here. Now, before I go on, let me give you a little bit of background on what the heck is NIST. So in 2006, George W. Bush signed, or 2006, George W. Bush signs an executive order saying, hey, we need to get our cybersecurity in order. We need to be more aggressive with cybersecurity. Agencies, go forth and do great things. And we had a bunch of federal agencies going all over the place creating their own cybersecurity programs. You had the Department of Interior cybersecurity program, you had the FBI cybersecurity program, you had Treasury, CIA, NSA, blah, blah, blah. And lo and behold, you have 20 plus different agencies, all with different types of standards and approaches and frameworks to become cybersecurity resilient. Not necessarily a good outcome. So then the regulators came back and said, look, we need one standard, we need one sheet of music that everybody can look to when designing their own cybersecurity program. And that is where NIST came in. If there is one thing you learned from this webinar, it is go become familiar with NIST and this framework. The National Institute of Standards and Technology combines the best and brightest minds in the public and private sector to come up with frameworks, tools, and educational materials to get everybody up to speed on cybersecurity. When the SEC is looking for examination questions and practices to probe advisors on, they are going to look at the NIST framework. The NIST framework at a 30,000 foot level is as follows. You want to identify the assets you have. I'm looking at the pinwheel here on the left. Identify the assets you have, protect the assets you have, detect intrusions and nefarious activity, respond to that activity, and recover from that activity. That is the National Institute of Standards and Technology framework that applies if you're a financial advisor, if you're operating a nuclear power plant, or if you're operating a credit card company. Regardless of the industry you're in, this is a framework that the biggest and brightest minds in the room have come up with. Now, let me show you what that looks like a little bit. When you click on that link, you'll get this PDF, and then you'll see this framework, which I just walked you through on the previous slide. It then dives into what identify your assets means. You have asset management, business environment, risk assessment, blah, 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 blah. These are the subsections, and you can go on, you can go even further from there. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. I can't stress this enough. Go to the NIST section. This is a great resource for advisors, and one of the biggest pushes from the federal government and the private sector is making the private sector aware that this actually exists. So if you're using the NIST as your framework, you can't go wrong. Now, let me go back to slide mode here. So you go to the NIST, you get your framework, great, you're reading it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this framework applies to everybody. It applies to not just advisors, it applies to everyone. So how are we actually going to convert this, you know, very broad framework to something that's actually relevant for advisors? Here's what I recommend you do. This is not easy, it takes time, but anything worth doing does take time. You can go to the NIST website, link down here below. You can get the framework. So what I showed you in the previous slide, that was basically the PDF version. A couple things. First off, this gets updated every year or so. So if you want a good, robust cybersecurity program, revisit this site every year and make sure you're using the up-to-date framework. So for example, we did a cybersecurity overhaul in July of this year. I went to the NIST website and I noticed, oh wow, version 1.1 just got updated as of April 2018. We are going to use the updated version for our cybersecurity program. And you can see there's a version 1.1 PDF with markup. You can go there, you can see the changes they made from last year, and then you can use the most up-to-date framework. But what I recommend is go to the NIST website, download the Excel version of the tables we just walked through, and then write a step that meets each subcategory. Now I want to pause here. You're going to say, now wait a minute, you just said you don't have any IT experience, that you're just getting your feet wet in cybersecurity, and now you're telling me to go to this very technical website and write a cybersecurity manual by myself. I hear you. Be patient here. What we have here is when you download this in Excel, you're going to have 120 rows of subcategories of steps that the NIST recommends you do in order to have a robust cybersecurity program. So this is what I would call a baseline assessment of your knowledge. So let's just look at this first row. So ID AM-1, physical devices and systems within the organization are inventoried. Now, this is basically saying, look, if you're a nuclear power plant or a financial advisor in a garage, you need to be doing something that achieves this subcategory. So what I would do is I would add a column to the right in Excel and just take your best educated guess at what that looks like. So Acme advisors will inventory all desktop, laptops, and mobile phones annually and check inventory monthly. That seems like a pretty good thing to do. If you have sensitive client data, you should probably keep track of where that data is physically, and you should probably spot check it to make sure that if someone lost their cell phone, you're aware of it, or if you add a new machine, it's updated in your inventory list. Now, we can't do the thinking for you here. If you are a financial advisor with 200 reps, that step of inventorying your physical inventory is going to look a lot different than if you're a one-man or woman band in a garage just by yourself. So you have to use nobody knows your firm better than you. You have to use common sense and what's most relevant to get through this. There's going to be a couple other things here. As you go through this framework, there's going to be things you may not know off the bat. Those are good things to highlight in yellow and say, research, maybe I need a vendor here, maybe I need to talk to some fellow colleagues in the community to see what best practice is. That's okay. The main goal here is to get an initial skeleton of your manual on paper. And this is a great way to do it. And I'll also say, a cybersecurity compliance manual doesn't necessarily have to be in Microsoft Word. If you have the NIST, the most recent NIST framework updated with detailed steps on what you're trying to do to achieve all of these subcategories, as well as a way to document to the SEC you're actually doing that, that is a great cybersecurity compliance manual. And I think that would pass muster with anyone. The bottom line is documenting the steps you're doing to actually have a program in the first place. So moving on. Now, we've talked about how do we build a manual. Now, what are some of the other off-the-shelf tools we can use to actually have a robust program? So FINRA is a great resource for your risk assessment. One of the most, as we mentioned earlier, one of the most critical pieces of a cybersecurity program is a risk assessment. And FINRA has already prepared a small firm cybersecurity checklist. Just Google FINRA small firm cybersecurity checklist, or you can go to this link here. You have all these cyber resources, but this big red button right here says download the cybersecurity checklist. What is the point of this checklist? Well, let's read. This checklist is primarily derived from the National Institute of Standards and Technology Cybersecurity Framework. Ta-da! Now you see why we use NIST and FINRA's report on cybersecurity practices. This basically says, hey, look, we've read the NIST framework. If you want to evaluate how your firm is doing as compared to the NIST framework, fill out this checklist. Okay, it doesn't create safe harbor. It's not a get out of jail free card, but from a risk assessment perspective, this is a great resource for a small firm to assess where their weaknesses are, document those, and then improve on their cybersecurity program. So you download the small firm cybersecurity checklist. Again, this is not fun. I wish I could tell you just have to download a cybersecurity manual, cut a check to somebody for $5,000 a year and be done. Unfortunately, the world doesn't work that way. But what you have here is you have an Excel workbook with 12 sections. It's pretty intuitive. I was able to fill it out. Again, I don't have a master's in computer science here. And it basically asks you questions. Where is the critical data of your firm located physically? You're going to write that out. You're going to document where that is. Then, okay, do you need this information to accomplish the mission? Yes or no? If no, okay, maybe you consider eliminating that data. If yes, okay, how do we protect that data? And it goes through all of the different types of the NIST framework. If you'll notice, the headlines here roughly follow the NIST framework: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. This is a great way to basically identify, okay, based on what we have right now, or the cybersecurity manual we're drafting, here's where we're strong, here's where we're weak. 12 action-packed worksheets of fun. I'm happy to talk about these offline, but definitely just start kicking the tires on these things and get familiar with it. Now, what is the point of doing this risk assessment? The last page in the small firm cybersecurity checklist is a list of to-dos that can improve your cybersecurity program. So I'll give you a very simple example. If you put in your data inventory, we collect all of our clients' social security numbers. And then the next question that the checklist asks you is, well, do you really need social security numbers to provide these services to your client? The answer is probably no. You don't need a client's social security number to give them a good financial plan or to know their or to do KYC for compliance purposes. So then the action plan could be, we can redact or purge our records of client social security numbers. Now, if you do tax planning or other things where you may need a social security number, that's different. Or if you're an accountant, obviously. But again, in general, that's what you may respond as. You're going to put explore redacting social security numbers from client files or whatever, and then that is going to output right here. And it's going to basically say, hey, you told us on the first worksheet that you want to redact your social security numbers. You told us on the second sheet you need to encrypt your data. You told us on the third sheet you're going to inventory physical assets, blah, blah, blah. And it's going to give you a nice, clean list of to-dos. And this is great because what you need to do is you need to PDF that, and you need to save it in a folder called Annual Risk Assessment. And you need to type a little memo to yourself saying, on this day, I, Chief Information Security Officer, pursuant to our cybersecurity manual, conducted an annual risk assessment, and we identified these 20 projects that are included in this memo as attachment A, and we're going to implement these in Q1 of next year. So when the SEC comes through and they say, okay, you've got a cybersecurity manual, you've got this risk assessment, prove to us you're actually doing it. All you have to do is you pull up that memo and you say, we identified these deficiencies or rooms for improvement. We identified these, we implemented them, and then we put them in our updated cybersecurity manual. Here's a red line version if you want to verify, and you're free to inspect whatever you'd like to ensure that we've gotten these things done. That's what cybersecurity is at a very high level. The SEC is looking for, do you have the processes in place to get better? Do you have the tools, procedures, and the mindset to implement a robust cybersecurity program? Now, there are lots of low-hanging fruit to help you. I'm not saying this list is going to give you a 100% A-OK cybersecurity program, far from it. But there is a lot of stuff that you can do, especially if you're a small shop, that can get you, the C+, B- answer. And then through your risk assessment, through talking with other advisors, maybe hiring a third-party consultant to examine what you've done to date, then you can get to that A+. But let's walk through some very basic things that I think any advisor can benefit from to implement a cybersecurity program. So let's just go through the top. Compliance manual. Step 1, go to the NIST framework, download an Excel. You're free to type something up in Word if you want a more traditional looking compliance manual or augment that. But your compliance manual, the blueprint for your compliance manual, is basically given to you for free by the best and brightest minds in the US government and private sector in the NIST framework. So download the NIST framework, build your compliance manual. Risk assessment, already covered that. Best and brightest minds in partnership with FINRA, small firm checklist, boom, done. Follow that disciplined, standardized approach. You can't go wrong there. Now, let's start talking about some technical things. Encryption. So encryption, most people know what this is, but if you don't know what encryption is, that's okay. It basically is a way to scramble your data so that even if your data gets stolen, it's scrambled and is very difficult to decode without the exact password that only you should have. Now, encryption used to be something that you'd have to install separately on your machine, but if you're using the most current version of Windows, Windows has what's called BitLocker. Ensure BitLocker is turned on. If you don't know what BitLocker is, Google BitLocker user guide, educate yourself on BitLocker, turn it on, and now you've encrypted your machine. Now, of course, there are vulnerabilities. There's things, you could argue that BitLocker is not as strong about, and you should use some other encryption system. But if you're not encrypting your data at all and you're starting at ground zero, why not use what Windows has already provided to at least get started? If you don't have access to BitLocker, there's other there's freeware and paidware software as a service models for encryption that you can use and learn more about. So there's encryption. Two-factor authentication. We use G Suite. We love G Suite because it has two-factor authentication. If you don't know what two-factor is, I'll do it really quick. When you log into your email and it asks for your password, two-factor then says, hey, we've sent a text message to your phone, enter that in too. That is two-factor authentication. Ensure two-factor authentication is turned on for your emails. One of the biggest sources of hacking for the DNC during the 2016 election was they didn't have two-factor turned on. Ensure two-factor is turned on. Don't know how to turn on two-factor? Google it, go to the Google website. If you use Outlook, Google what the options are for Outlook. Two-factor is a great way, low-hanging fruit, to give you some really good protection up front. Updates and patches. So again, whether you're using antivirus software off the shelf, Windows Defender is baked into Windows. Ensure that your machines have updates and automatic patching turned on and it's being used. One of the biggest risks to your firm's security is not the Russians, is not the North Koreans, is not the Iranians. It's Todd turning off his Windows updates because he doesn't want to update his machine. That is the biggest risk to your firm, in my opinion, for most advisors. So make sure you have policies and procedures in place to ensure Windows Defender is turned on. Now, you can have very high-speed text solutions. You can have enterprise management software that sends you automated alerts and does all that great thing. And if you have the ability to implement that, great. We started out with an affirmation process in an Excel-based system that says, I affirm that I'm not turning off my updates and patches, and we inspected machines every month to ensure that the policy was being enforced. And now we've graduated from that, but again, if you're starting from zero, you can start slow and ramp up. What about data security? So, most of us are storing data in the cloud now. How do we ensure we're choosing the right providers? Do we keep servers on-site, off-site, blah, blah, blah? Cloud security is increasingly important. I highly recommend, I wrote a blog post on vendor management. I'll touch on that in a second, but the federal government has awarded certain certification status to certain cloud providers that meet their high standards for data security. So in part and parcel with the government initiative I described earlier, the FedRAMP initiative, you can go to fedramp.gov to learn more about it, basically says, if you are FedRAMP certified, you meet the highest standards. You are now authorized to be selected by any government agency for cloud-based services. A lot of cloud service providers are FedRAMP certified. So if you go to fedramp.gov, you can look on that site. You can see, okay, great. Google Drive is on there. Amazon Web Services are there. A couple others are there. Those might be your vendors of choice, because if it's good enough for the NSA, it's probably good enough for you. You still need to do your due diligence, but that's a great start. If your cloud service provider is not FedRAMP certified, that's okay, but you need to do due diligence on those vendors and say, okay, what are your certifications? I'll get into vendor management in just a second, but things to consider. Network security. Now, if you're a financial advisor with 300 offices and you have your own internal servers, you're going to need something more robust than what I'm about to describe. Most advisors we talk to are small shops, smaller operations. They typically store everything in the cloud. They don't have servers on site. The best security measure you can implement for your network personal network are a couple things. One, you should have a guest network for wireless and a worker network for your wireless security. You can Google how to segment your wireless network and follow those steps. But one of the easiest ways to improve your network security is to buy a new router. So routers 5 years ago when they were sold to the public were typically sold, imagine buying a house with all the windows open, the front door open, and the garage door open. That's how routers were sold 5 years ago. And what industry and government has noticed is that we really should default routers to a more secure security posture, and then the customer can, if they want to, log in and start opening ports and doing other things. 99.9% of the population does not do this. So my advice to you, if you're a small advisory shop and you've got a router that's 5 years old or older, go to Best Buy and buy a new router. Buy a default router. You can Google around and see what's most secure, do your research. But buying a new router, the new routers are mostly going to be defaulted to higher security requirements. Also, talking about nation state actors probably aren't as interested in you as they are in your custodian or your bank. But if you're an American advisor, you could probably assume that the NSA will be able to hack into your American router, but the Chinese can't. If you buy a Huawei router, you probably are going to be enabling another nation state actor. That's the reality of the world we live in today. So if you're US-based advisor, I recommend just buying a Cisco or other domestic router. But of course, for our international colleagues, you're free to choose whatever router aligns with your nation state preference. Vendor management. So vendor management, a key focus of vendor management for advisors this year is on how are you managing vendors, because the SEC understands you're not going to do everything in-house. You're going to rely on Google Cloud for your data backup. You're going to rely on XYZ vendor for encryption. You're going to rely on this custodian to actually custody your client's assets, etc. The SEC wants to understand, okay, what are you doing to have due diligence on your vendors? Again, check out that blog post. I would say you're basically looking at 3 levels of vendor classification. First, are they FedRAMP certified? If your vendor is FedRAMP certified, that is a darn good certification that they have been put through the ringer to be able to demonstrate to the federal government that they have the necessary cyber controls that can prevent against nation state hacks and otherwise. If they're not FedRAMP certified, ask for a SOC 2 certificate. A SOC 2 certificate is a very robust certification. It's signed off on by typically a large accounting firm, and Ernst & Young, others, attesting to the fact that they are comfortable with their cyber controls and procedures to safeguard data. If they're not SOC 2 certified, then you need to start digging into what their compliance policies are, their insurance, et cetera, et cetera. Granted, you can do that for all of your vendors, but if you're looking to get started, that is the framework I'd operate on for vendor management. Network map. This sounds really funny, but one of the things the SEC in those PDFs I pointed out in the beginning of the webinar, the SEC says, do you have a network map? Are you aware of what your network is and what assets are tied into it? And that may sound really silly. Why the heck would I want to sit down and draw out a network map that's incredibly low tech, inefficient, doesn't seem like it's preventing anything? It is a great activity to do, and I'll tell you why. When you start drawing out your network map, you're going to say, okay, this is our office, and we have 4 machines, and it's connected to a router, and then it goes to the internet and our service providers. And then you're going to think, well, is there anybody else attached to this network? And you say, well, I do have a laptop I work from at home. And oh yeah, well, we all have iPhones that are also used for personal use. And oh, well, sometimes, like if my laptop's not available, I use my wife's laptop to log into Dropbox, and on and on and on. The network map, as low tech as it sounds, is actually a great forcing mechanism for advisors to realize how big their network actually is. And don't let your network borders be the borders of your office perimeter. Your network is anywhere you conduct business. And if that business is a Starbucks, if that business is your house, if that business is on your spouse's laptop, guess what? They're part of that network. And so that is something that when you start looking at your risk assessment from FINRA, that is something you need to incorporate. Okay, if I'm going to log into our business from a Starbucks, how do I safeguard against that? If I'm going to use a laptop that may not necessarily be run through our new equipment checklist that I just drafted because it's in the NIST framework, what do I think about that, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, there's a culture of information sharing and best practice sharing that the SEC wants to encourage, along with the Department of Homeland Security. And what this means is if a breach or vulnerability is found by a bank in Kansas, they want some way, somehow, for a financial advisor in New England to learn about it quickly. They want the private sector to help facilitate a rapid response of information sharing. Great. How the heck do I, as an advisor in a garage, do this? Easy. Google DHS CERT listserv. The Department of Homeland Security has an alert listserv that automatically pumps out all the vulnerabilities they're seeing from a wide variety of industries. Now, full disclaimer, most of these alerts are not going to apply. You're going to get an email from the Department of Homeland Security that says, hey, if you're using this 1970s electrical switch for nuclear power plants, it has a critical vulnerability, you should probably swap it out. Doesn't apply to us. However, there is the occasional, hey, there's a Windows vulnerability here. Hey, there's a Windows XP vulnerability, whatever the software is that you may use. You occasionally see these. So when the SEC says, hey, how are you staying abreast of day one vulnerabilities or new vulnerabilities that are discovered in the private sector, you can say, our Chief Compliance Officer, Chief Information Security Officer receives daily updates from the Department of Homeland Security on all recently discovered vulnerabilities and patch remediation actions. Simple things. Everything I've described here, for the most part, does not require a tremendous amount of IT know-how. What it does require is it requires discipline, it requires a willingness to do some research and figure things out, and it requires the ability to follow a process and stay true to yourself and make sure that if you're going to do something, you're doing something in a demonstrable, systematic way. Finally, and then we'll open the questions here. You want to implement a simple process to carry out your manual. As I mentioned earlier, the SEC isn't just going to be happy with, great, you have a cybersecurity manual. They want you to prove to them how you're actually carrying out your manual. Now, of course, there's all sorts of tech solutions that are great. We use Smartsheet. Smartsheet is awesome. I highly recommend Smartsheet. We don't get referrals or anything from them, fees or anything. We just really love them. Smartsheet's great, but you can use Excel. If your cybersecurity manual says, hey, we need to do these things, you can type up your compliance system in Excel, and you can set calendar reminders in Outlook and say, okay, cybersecurity tasks 1 through 3 due today, whatever. That is an extremely low tech way to do it, but it works. And that's what we can do. I've talked to several advisors that manage billions of dollars that they use Excel and Outlook calendar reminders. It's not the most elegant, it's not the most beautiful, but it gets it done. Finally, on the simple processes to carry out, have a sign-off process to document completion. You want somebody to own these processes, because the last thing you want to have is when a process doesn't get done, you don't want 5 people in the room pointing to everybody else saying, well, I thought they were doing it. You need one person as kind of the quarterback, the owner of that process. That doesn't mean they necessarily have to do that process themselves, but they're responsible for ensuring it gets done, and they're accountable if it doesn't get done. Most important step, train your employees. As I mentioned earlier, your employees are your biggest cybersecurity risk. It's not the Russians. It's not the Iranians. It's not the North Koreans. It's Chuck in HR. Watch out for Chuck. So I made this, this is an actual quote from Ogedai Khan. He was the second Khan of the Mongol Empire, conqueror of the Jin dynasty, and cybersecurity overlord of all that is living. And this is an actual quote from his annual cybersecurity training to Mongolian forces in 1231. And I quote, "And woe be to him who useth unauthorized thumb drives. Great suffering shall fall upon your village. Your horses shall be slaughtered, your people enslaved, and your Wi-Fi credentials revoked for eternity." I repeat this verbatim every week at a very loud volume in front of my team members at Alpha Architect. It is highly effective, and it is also one of the reasons why I'm encouraged to work remotely most of the time. Bottom line, folks, train your employees, document the training. And if you pause back and say, well, wait a minute, I don't have training materials, how do I do this? Go to the NIST framework and pick out the 10 things that keep you up at night the most. Go to your cybersecurity manual, review what the weaknesses are in your risk assessment, and talk about those. again, we have to get out of the mindset of I need off-the-shelf training, I need off-the-shelf resources, I need somebody else to train my employees about accountability on cyber hygiene. If you can own these processes, if you can say we are going to demonstrate extreme ownership on cybersecurity and we are going to become the experts in it, that is going to be your best defense against cyber attacks going forward. So train your employees, document it. Every time we've been examined by regulators, one of the first questions they ask, please show us your training materials, please show us your training attendance roster, and please show us your affirmation that all of your employees have been trained. So if Todd or Chuck misses training, guess who's doing another training session? You have to make sure you get 100% coverage. A few blog posts to help. Just Google these terms, you should find it, but I've outlined on our blog how to build an investment advisor cybersecurity program, SEC cybersecurity requirements for RIAs, vendor management and cybersecurity compliance, and pen testing for financial advisors. You can read these at your leisure. They're incredibly boring. They're horribly written. The guy who wrote them is kind of a jerk, but it's free. And if you do decide to hire a third-party vendor, hopefully it gets you a little bit smarter, a little bit more educated, so you can ask sharper questions and get a little bit more bang for your buck. Takeaways before we go to questions. Read the NIST framework. The SEC reads it too. Takeaway 2, writing your manual equals knowing your manual. If you just copy a compliance manual from somebody else and save it on your drive, when the SEC asks you about your compliance manual, you're going to look like a doe in the headlights, and they will very quickly know that they're dealing with most advisors who have a compliance manual but don't really review it and don't focus on it. Write your manual so you understand your manual. Takeaway 3, look at that low-hanging fruit. Again, I'm not saying that's a perfect solution. I know there are better solutions out there, and I know you're still exposed to attacks if you do all those things, but at a minimum, you can do those things. They're free or low cost, and you can control your destiny a bit. Takeaway 4, document your processes. Documentation is critical. Takeaway 5, use common sense. One of my favorite examples is data retention. The SEC requires data retention for 7 years. Then I talk to advisors who have client records that are no longer clients, by the way, from 20 years ago, that are just sitting in filing cabinets or on shared drives or whatever. Understand, do you really need to keep this information? The greatest way to limit the effectiveness of a cyber attack is to limit the data that gets stolen. Cybersecurity is all about protecting the data. The less data you keep, the safer you are. So a very low-tech way to harden yourself against a cybersecurity attack is to really be shrewd when it comes to data retention, document retention. Have a plan, have a process, and use that. And finally, learning is cumulative. Nobody is an expert on day one. When we started with cybersecurity, we had a lot to learn, we had a lot to improve on, but we got there, and we're still getting there. And I'm sure there's things that you all can teach us that we can learn and be better. So, it's a team effort. Help each other out. A rising tide lifts all boats, and I hope this was helpful. So I will pause here. Cynthia, to reiterate my lack of knowledge on how to use questions and whatnot, you may have to tell me how to see the questions again, but
well, I'm actually going to tell everyone how to find that questions panel, Patrick. Over in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll find a list of titles and look for the questions title bar. Now, that title bar, double-clicking, will expand or open up the questions panel, and please type any questions or comments that you might have for Patrick there, and so that we can see them and respond. Now, while I am waiting for any additional questions, I also want to remind you at this point that we have been recording today's webinar, and not only will you get a direct link to today's recorded playback, you'll also find included in that follow-up message will be the slides that were used today. All of the links in the slides will be available for you as well. So if you do want to come back, review the concepts, or drill down into any of the information that Patrick has provided, simply watch your email later on this afternoon for a direct link. Now, for those of you who may be listening to this recording, also want you to be aware that this same information will be available on the Interactive Broker website. Underneath the education menu, you can find a webinars section where you can locate any of our prior recordings. So we'll provide this information to you in several different ways. But for right now, I do see a couple of questions that have come in. So, Patrick, are you able to see those questions, or would you prefer I read them out? Patrick, you're muted right now. If you're responding, please unmute yourself. There you go.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I saw one. It said, Patrick Cleary, why are you so awkward, from Colin Breen. That's going to take a whole nother webinar, Colin. There's a lot of personal history there. But thank you for the question. Also, full disclosure, I love my mother-in-law. So if my wife ever listens to this webinar, just want to clarify that. Go ahead, Cynthia.
Okay, there is a comment there, and I want to reiterate that. Thank you for very much for putting this together. Engaging, enlightening, and very educational. So thanks for that comment, John. Now you see there are some additional questions that are coming in besides Colin's. Can you see any of those additional questions?
I just see the bottom one. Maybe you could read. Maybe you could read them out.
While I'm reading it, what you can do, Pat, is click and drag the corner, and it will expand that window. So if you, and that way you will be able to see those questions that come in.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, go ahead and read while we do. Oh, there we go. Awesome. Got it.
I see the light. Very good.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. You want me to take these?
Yes, please do.
Okay. Is this all that the SEC will look for when visiting a small advisor firm? From John. John, great question. The SEC, and this applies to anything, does not want to paint themselves into a corner. So they're never going to say, this is the exhaustive list. This is the, these are the 100 questions we're going to talk about. They're always going to leave it open-ended so they have the ability to navigate. I mean, cybersecurity is changing so quickly. Regulations in general are changing so quickly. So the answer, sadly, is I wish I had the 100 questions that the SEC says this is all we're going to ask. But those links I showed you at the beginning, especially that OCIE 2015 PDF, that is the best article I found from the SEC on what a sample list of questions looks like. So no, I don't have the watertight list of SEC questions, but you can get 95% there from looking there. We covered, Pat, why are you so awkward? John, another question. Let's see. Lori, I listen to a lot of questions. I like this is the best. Oh, thanks, Lori. Awesome. Or maybe Lori just hasn't listened to a lot of webinars. Francisco, what about crypto assets? Okay, Francisco, great question. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you are minimizing your exposure to sensitive data. So for example, if you have a client with a bunch of crypto, if there is some way that they can attest to you what their crypto assets are, so let's say you're doing a financial plan and they have $1 million in Bitcoin. The best way, the safest way is okay, client, please send me whatever statement you have or verification on crypto assets you own, and I will incorporate that into your financial plan or update. That's the cleanest way. You're not touching the crypto assets. You don't have the security key. That's not being sent over email. That's the best way to do it. Another thing you can do, I don't know if there's other portals that have balances on this stuff, but if you can be granted viewer only access to those balances, that's another way to do it. But the bottom line is you just don't want to touch the data. What you should not do with crypto is share passwords, share the keys for the crypto. You want to keep your hands off it as best as you can. So if you're only meeting with the client once a quarter, once a year, just say, hey, for your crypto assets, those are sensitive. I just need you to verify what you hold on a quarterly basis. That'd be the low-tech solution. Jeffrey Barnett, Patrick, are there any compliance consultants you recommend for helping small RIAs, not just with cybersecurity, but with compliance programs more broadly? Jeffrey, that's a tough question. So I would say your best bet, I have a couple folks I could recommend offline. It really depends. I would say regardless of what you do, make sure you do kind of the low-hanging fruit stuff here first, as well as with other compliance stuff. I'd be happy to just share some other best practices with you. Just know that the amount of money you spend is not necessarily commensurate with the quality you receive. So you may be able to get a lot of very good low-cost advice. RIA in a box could really help you out to start, or a good securities lawyer could help you before you start spending big bucks on things like that. Francisco, is there official?
Patrick,
Yes.
if
Yeah.
I could jump in on that question, I also want everyone to know that on the Interactive Brokers website, underneath the products menu, we do have an investors marketplace where we've got quite a few firms that may be able to provide the information that you're looking for. So drill down into the products menu, the investor marketplace, and then you'll find a find services button where you can specify what it is that you're looking for to get a list of additional information and access as well. So a quick plug for those folks that have or that are participating in our investor marketplace. So back to you now, Patrick.
Sure. Jeffrey, one great question. One thing I would say is when you're evaluating compliance consultants, you really want to press them hard on, okay, how much of this is just one-time advice versus what will you do for me if I get audited by the SEC or the state securities regulator? Because what I found is that everybody says up front, oh yes, we provide great support for your SEC audit and blah, blah, blah. And we're going to be there for you. And then when you actually get audited, it's kind of like everybody scurries into the darkness. It's like you are alone and unafraid in front of that regulator. So get really clear letters of engagement from that consultant on, okay, I'm going to provide you with SEC support. Okay, you provide me with SEC support. Do you come on site? Do you stay for the whole thing? Do you help me draft the responses? Are you liable for any mistakes? Those are the things you want to get clarity on, because if you don't get clarity on that now, you will get clarity when the SEC is sitting in your office. So make sure you push them there. Another great question from Jeffrey. What processes do you recommend for monitoring outside intrusions into the network, such as Fortinet? The main, it really depends, Jeffrey. So it depends. We use different systems for different things. So we have a website, for our public frame. So we use Cloudflare. We really like Cloudflare. They're cheap. They're very effective. They prevent denial of service. But kind of tying to the crypto question earlier, we try and remove the attack surface. I don't want to try and protect the attack surface. I want to just remove it entirely. So client statements, Interactive Brokers can provide, we use Interactive Brokers. Interactive Brokers provides them direct to the client. I don't have to touch client statements, right? You can set up alerts. We have alerts. There's a lot of internal stuff with Google Vault. You can obviously pay for more higher speed, low drag. The problem is with a lot of these intrusion detection is that if you're good enough to crack through Google, if you're good enough to crack through some of these encrypted networks, you're also going to be good enough to cover your tracks. So what we recommend is, at a minimum, make sure your alerts are set on for, hey, a computer signed in to Google Suite from this location. Hey, your password was changed. Make sure those generic network perimeter alerts are triggered and active, and then you can do diligence on your own. But I'd say unless you're like custodying client assets, or unless you have like really sensitive data that, again, I wouldn't recommend keeping, most advisors can just get rid of that risk entirely. But it's a great question. I mean, some folks will have to have better systems. There's no way around it. Any other questions, folks? Oh, how are the wide range of communication methods, email, Facebook, LinkedIn, being viewed by the SEC for auditability? John, that is a great question. Social media is basically treated like regular advertising. So if you go on, so there's a couple things. One, you need to archive your social media. You need to have a social media policy in your compliance manual. That's not necessarily a cybersecurity thing, but in your compliance manual, you need a social media policy. We formalized one last year because that was a gap we identified during our annual risk assessment. But what you need to do is, at a minimum, you need to archive them. You need to have a policy, and you need to be aware that if you're on social media and you make a recommendation on a security or whatever, the SEC looks at your personal social media as an extension of the firm. So we basically say, hey, listen, if you want to be on social media, don't talk stocks, don't have clients, don't have clients, say you're a great financial advisor, because that's a third-party testimonial. That's not allowed. And any marketing material you put on a social media platform needs to go through a marketing material audit, just like you need to do for regular marketing materials. So I'd say Social media, there's nothing radically different about social media. It's old wine in new bottles, but the main thing that most advisors miss is you need an archive capability for your social media posts. Just Google whatever you're using with, Twitter archive. How do I archive my Twitter post, whatever, and you can set up some automatic stuff there, and it's free. So, great question. Awesome. Okay, team. Well, I really enjoyed presenting this to you. Please reach out if you have more questions, and we love you, Interactive Brokers. Thank you for doing this, and it's a great opportunity. So I wish you all the very best.
Thank you, Patrick.
And terrific information, Patrick. I want to thank you so much for today's presentation and remind everyone to watch your inbox later on this afternoon for a direct link and access to the webinar notes. Later on this afternoon, we'll be sending it out. Also, I'm going to grab the controls back for right now, and I'm going to ask Emmett if you've got any additional information. Go ahead and if you can close us out here this afternoon, I'll put your information. Let me actually put this up on the screen. If you do have any questions for Interactive Brokers, Emmett has been with us throughout today's presentation, and I've left his contact information on the screen as well. So with that,
yes.
Emmett, any last words?
Yes, thanks for everyone for joining. If anyone has any questions about setting up a new relationship with Interactive Brokers, please feel free to contact me. If you already have an existing relationship, then you may either have a sales rep you've been working with that you're free to contact and follow up with any further questions, or our advisor support desk, or you can certainly email me as well if you'd like. Thank you.
Well, thanks to all of you for your participation in our event today. That is going to conclude our session. I want to thank all of you for the time that you've spent with us here today. And special thanks to Alpha Architect for making today's presentation possible. So with that, have a great rest of your day, everyone, and thanks.